Every once in a while, it's good to take a fresh look at the origin story. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you may have seen my very first video called Ken Ham Made Me an Atheist, which was a quick intro into me with a clickable title. Or maybe my more recent Why I Am Not a Christian video, which is more of a current position statement. I've gone into more depth of my deconversion story on other channels, including Pine Creek and Neil the 604 Atheist, but I think my favorite telling has been on a Christian podcast called Recovering Evangelicals, hosted by Luke Janssen and Boyd Blundell. The podcast describes itself as for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. The hosts remain Christians, but understand potential challenges from science, philosophy, and history. They tend to have fascinating discussions there, and I'd highly encourage you to find the link in the description and check them out. They had me on as part of a series on Young Earth Creationism, and the various possible reactions from Christians who have such a worldview challenged. My segment represented the reaction of one who ultimately leaves the faith. With Luke and Boyd's permission, I'd like to share that chat with you here today, unedited, and so including their Christian perspective on my journey. While this isn't my usual look at Christian claims, perhaps it will lend some insight into the man behind this channel, or perhaps my struggles will resonate with you, whether you arrived at the same conclusions I did or not.
Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm Luke Janssen.
And I'm Boyd Blundell.
Last week I mentioned the three general coping strategies that young Earth creationists take when their faith comes up hard against a science that paints a picture of a world that goes back many billions of years and life evolving from one form into others. The first coping strategy is to reject the scientific data. We talked about that strategy last week. This week we want to look at the second strategy, reject the faith. I know many people who ended up rejecting Christian faith, and for a variety of reasons, although there's common themes or threads. In fact, the listeners will know that I myself was essentially one of those until I found a way to go for option 3, which is next week's topic. And so I had no shortage of people to talk to in person about this strategy of giving up faith. But I really wanted to talk to this one person who fits into this camp, our guest today, whom I met only recently, in the past few months in fact, and only online so far. And the reason I want to talk to him is he's not just one more face in a large crowd. He stands out among the rest because of his reach and influence in this area. A lot of people may not know our guest by his proper name, Paul Enns, but he's popular on social media by the name Paulogia. I referred to him a month ago in the second of our mini-series on evangelicalism. He's got a YouTube channel with 44,000 followers, and the tagline on his channel reads, "A former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians, wherever science is being denied in the name of ancient books." And his reach and influence is reflected in the people he's had on his show, both as allies and opponents, co-hosts and targets, who themselves are high-profile speakers or writers or social media personalities in their own right. So on the one hand, there's a long list of people who would share his current views, people who were once Christians themselves, some even prominent ones, but they've since rejected their Christian faith and become very loud and influential anti-evangelists. So people like Matt Dillahunty, who's got 132,000 subscribers, and another one who goes by the YouTube and Facebook name Viced Rhino, a fellow Canadian with 54,000 subscribers. And on the other hand, his work has put him in direct conversation with, or shall I really say direct conflict with, people like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, Eric Hovind of Hovind Ministries, the son of the infamous Kent Hovind, William Lane Craig of Reasonable Faith, and Sean McDowell, a well-known speaker and writer, and some of us may remember he's the son of Josh McDowell, whose book, Evidence Demands a Verdict, that'll be very familiar to evangelicals who go back to the 70s and 80s. It sold 1 million copies. So, for Paul to be engaging directly with such big names in the evangelical world of Christian apologists, he's clearly an influential voice in this conversation. We talked to Paul about his story.
So, Like many a prairie boy in Canada, I was raised in a Mennonite community and in a Mennonite church, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a very evangelical, very literal type denomination of the faith that typically believes in a young earth, and we actually wouldn't have spent a lot of time thinking about that. So anyway, I was raised in that community. I enthusiastically did Bible camps. When I was in high school, I spent a lot of time attending youth conferences, attending youth events, and my main passion was actually Bible quizzing, which was memorizing the Bible. At one point, I could quote virtually the entire New Testament, a lot of it anyway, and then went to Bible school on full scholarship because of that, really dug into what I learned at Bible school. After Bible school, I did go on to secular careers in software industry first, and then into the movie industry, and later in the comic industry, and lots of different cool things.
Do you want to talk about that movie industry?
Well, sure. No, movie industry is my, subtle way of saying I went to work for George Lucas on the Star Wars prequels. So that was a very cool part of my life. And if you can imagine a Mennonite boy from Saskatchewan who has experienced nothing outside of that, getting yanked up from that and dropped into the middle of San Francisco, culturally, that's a big shock. Right. And weirdly, I maintained my Christianity the entire time I was there. It wasn't until I left San Francisco that I started doing all this other introspection. So it's maybe not the story people would normally expect. But all that said, all that time, both here in Canada and in the States, I was heavily involved with youth ministry, particularly the Bible quizzing ministry I was talking about. I was head of that for Saskatchewan for a while, then California for a while, and involved with international competitions on that level, coaching hundreds of kids. I was also involved with music ministry, including got up to doing some Promise Keeper events, which were, big rock concerts in and of themselves.
Oh, yeah. I remember those.
So, I was in it. Even despite my secular careers, ministry was my thing. I was at church 5 times a week. It's all the things. So fast forward to, because of the nature of my work and projects, sometimes it's project-based. And so between projects, because of a graphic novel I've been writing that involved dinosaurs.
Yeah, and I know this story. I want to ask a couple questions before we get to that.
Sure.
Right. So before you came to the point of rejecting your faith, how did you deal with things like the Big Bang and dinosaurs and things?
So generally, I raised myself. I have a hard time knowing at what level the indoctrination came from my parents, or just what I wanted to be true, or how my mind works. My pastors and my Bible school teachers and everyone I was involved with was so sure that the young earth and that all these things were correct, and that they would brush these other science ideas aside so readily. I basically just said, you know what? They have spent their time looking into it. I don't need to spend my time looking into it. They assure me that we have great answers to all these things that I'm hearing. So I will just move on with my day because it doesn't affect me. I was passionate about the New Testament. I was passionate about youth work. I was passionate about music. So whether the science lined up, people were assuring me it was fine. So I just took their word. I was very much a slave to authority.
Wow. Now, I remember in one of your videos, you mentioned that you were taught to disbelieve or to distrust the science. How do they do that?
Again, from that authority, you generally get this mistrust of the outgroup. You get the mistrust of, well, if scientists are telling us that we came from monkeys, then we should treat them as suspect on everything. I think part of what helps undermine is the economy where I am, which is kind of oil-based and based on agriculture and a lot of things. We don't want the scientists to be right about anything. We don't want them to be right about climate change. They're wrong about miracles. They're just wrong in general. And so part of it is just this general, it's not blatant. It's not like don't trust science, but it's constantly saying when science rubs up against the Bible is just correct without any question. It just is.
Right.
So, and this is actually an Answers in Genesis mission statement. And one of their things that they say is, if the science and the Bible conflict, the Bible is just automatically right. And that's one of the things you sign when you go work there. So when you feel like there's a conflict, as I did, I felt like the 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs died, was in conflict with what I knew about Noah's flood. Well, then the Bible is just right. And maybe we don't understand the mechanisms of how it's right, but I'm just going to trust that it is.
Right. So you were working on this video. You had an idea for a video.
Yeah. So I was working.
That's a graphic novel he's writing.
Well,
okay.
I was, as I said, I was in the comic industry. And when we write novels, the thick ones, that they're graphic novels. And I was working on one that involved dinosaurs. It's called Neozoic.
Neozoic?
Yeah.
And were you involved with a company at all?
So I'd formed a publishing company called Red 5 Comics.
Okay.
And this was one, we published many, many titles. For comics in the early 2000s, it actually sold really well. and that enough to spawn a sequel and that kind of thing. And it was actually weirdly, it's a side thing. It was actually based on King David. In my head, it was very much. It was a retelling of a lot of the Old Testament stuff, but with dinosaurs involved. And anyway, that all fell apart. And because this wasn't a Christian project per se, it was meant for a wide secular audience. I knew what I thought about dinosaurs, but I felt, well, I'll throw in a few nods here and there, maybe to what they say. And so I wanted to look up just a few facts that I could sprinkle in without hurting what my beliefs were, but talk to them. So for the very first time, even though I loved dinosaurs, had all the dinosaur books, I started paying attention to, this one's 65 million, this one's 115. Like, why are they picking different numbers of millions of years? Because in your creationist head, it's like, well, they were all created day 6, so they're all walking at the same time. But my book kind of needed to know at least what these evil secular scientists thought the order of progression was of when these things had appeared. So at least I could get the order right. Maybe the stegosaurs were in the morning and the T-Rex got made in the afternoon. I don't know how day 6 works. But anyhow, so I looked up those details, and some of the stuff that they were presenting made a lot of sense to me. But again, I was living in this world where if science conflicts with the Bible, the Bible's right. So I just let that accumulate in the back. But what it did, of course, was create some cognitive dissonance as we went. My mind, there was this itch now in my brain of like, well, those scientists were actually making some sense to you. So fast forward to a time when that project was done, and I was waiting for a next project in the visual effects industry that I was working on. I had a little bit of time. I'm like, well, I'm going to go. My pastors and my teachers are also sure that the evidence is great. So I'm just going to read it for myself so I can get rid of this scratch in the back of my brain. I'll just learn what they know so that I can be equally as confident as they are. And so I look it up online, and the best-selling creation books by far are the Ken Ham Answers books. There's 3 volumes. There's 4 now. These are the quick reads. You can get all the answers you want. So I order those. Great. I'm going to have this problem's going to go away. The brain scratch is going to be gone. So I start reading them. I tear into them when they get here. And even though I believe what Ken Ham believes, these answers seemed terrible. They seemed flimsy, even though I agreed with his conclusions. And that was troubling, because then it was like, well, how good if this is the best that Young Earth Creationism has to offer, why is everyone so sure? And the one that really sunk it, where I literally had just dropped the book and it fell to the floor, was how did kangaroos get to Australia? Did they really jump from Mount Ararat somehow and leave literally no trace and get to Australia? So in the Ken Ham book, it says that kangaroos, because in the flood, there would have been lots of carnage. There probably were lots of logs floating around. So yeah, the kangaroos somehow jumped from Ararat to the tip of India. And then from there, for some reason, they jumped on logs, and the logs floated them to the continent. And happily ever after, no kangaroos appeared anywhere else. And I just dropped the book. I'm like, that can't be the best possible answer to this question, that they jumped on logs.
Right.
And so from there, I said, you know what? Let me at least read what these secular people say. And went from there.
Where are you in this? Are you in San Francisco at this point?
No, I'm in Calgary at that point.
Okay. Like post San Francisco or?
Post San Francisco,
yeah.
And up until reading these books from Answers in Genesis, up until that point, you were fully committed to your faith and looking at ministry, working in ministry?
Working in ministry up and, I was still, although it was this weird thing where I started having other people pray because I was feeling really guilty that I was having doubts. And I felt like I couldn't pray in front of people anymore when some of this doubty stuff was happening. I don't know if that's a common experience or not.
I've had this conversation with Luke because he leads music. And he's like, when I was younger, it's like I just felt like I couldn't lead the music this will get back to a theme of what I think about evangelicals and doubt, like just the concept. Because I was wondering, because I would think that one of the dangers I certainly see in this sort of social control mode is traveling, changing location, changing context is a real danger.
It is, yeah.
Because just having multiple perspectives on anything, right? Like you go from Saskatchewan to San Francisco on how to live life, on how to organize your day. On
I'm meeting my first openly gay people of my life, as far as I know. Right.
They don't have horns. They're not monsters. They're nicer than some of the people you knew back home. Yep. And so those all dissonant moments kind of I feel like they just add up eventually. And so I was curious as to when this happened, but it was San Francisco.
I was already back
to Calgary.
I was already back into Canada's Bible Belt here. So the other weird thing, for me, I'd always been taught that the Bible was either 100% true or you couldn't trust it.
Right. Yeah.
And so as soon as you get to 99, now what? Right? Yeah.
Perfect riddle. You see this all across the evangelical I mean, and this is not just evangelical, all across ideological spectrums, that when you make these black or white things, right? Like in sexual morality, it's the virgin whore problem, right?
Right.
Like the idea that like, oh, well, this has happened once. Like there's no point in even managing this anymore because I'm already way on the other end of it.
Yeah.
Because there's no middle ground.
So that must have been more like the straw that broke the camel's back kind of a moment for you.
It was one of those things where I don't know what is right, but I now know what is wrong. And I was in the camp of wrong.
Wow.
So at that point, I mean, to me, I've never read that stuff, like the Ken Ham stuff. Although, like, you know, I think about the stuff that I had seen because, you know, Promise Keepers and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, wow, when you look back at it. But at the moment, I feel like that kind of moment is like, if you asked me, like I'm writing graphic novels right now, if I had to come up with a story, I would do much better than this.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like if I had to like make up a story, I would do much better than the stuff I'm reading here. So now I have this sense that these people aren't my like intellectual superiors at all, and that there's not a lot of reason I should trust them.
But not only that, yeah, the trust is the exact right word, because at that point, that's when you start feeling like, wait, people have been lying to me about this, or at least how confident I should be. What else have I been lied to about? Right. That's suddenly the door, the wedge that is like, oh no, now I need to investigate the Bible. Now I need to investigate everything and start from scratch.
And you mentioned it dropped from 100% certain to 99, and that was too much of a drop.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's only 100 and 0, man. This is a light switch.
It's a very binary faith I had.
So a lot of dominoes started falling. How long did it take for you to come to the decision that you came to?
So from there, I immediately I had to do the exact same process. I know nothing about evolution. I know nothing about science. That hasn't really been my purview in any way. So then what should I read? So I start reading Dawkins, and I start reading, you know, Bill Nye books. And I start because I have to start from the ground up. I can't dump deep into science papers. I thought nothing exploded and monkeys came out of the water and we were a couple generations after a monkey. Like that's what my understanding of this level was, right? So I had to start from scratch. So I started just really digging into the science books. So I looked at the things I felt like I knew and what was the best counter for that. And then I would, you know, find that counter, which eventually leads you online into, you know, blogs and onto YouTube and things like that. But I was more trying to read the books. So over the process of about 5 months, it was where it took me from not understanding evolution at all to being able to tell you all about the fusion of human chromosome 2 and endogenous retroviruses, and that these things were too solid for evolution to not be true. Now, I think as a lot of people in our audience will attest, knowing those things is completely irrelevant to the question of, did Jesus die for my sins? Right? Like, or does God exist? Like, those are not relevant questions. So I kind of cheat in one of my first videos and say, you know, Ken Ham made me an atheist. Not really. I understand fully how people can hold both things to be true. Okay, evolution and the earth is old. True. God also true, and Jesus also true. I understand how people can put those together. But as I kind of alluded to, I was kind of like, okay, I know people have reconciled these things, and I read people like Peter Enns and other people or Hugh Ross and Paulogia, and they had ways of reconciling these things. But if I've been lied to about this stuff, should I take a step further back? And I did. So then I started going after the Bible, or what I thought I knew about the Bible. And was probably another 6 months of going through and just looking at, can I trust who wrote these books, and can I trust the content of them? And, oh, did you know that some of these passages weren't originally there, and textual criticism and all these things, again, that I've been teaching kids to memorize the New Testament for decades at this point, but I hadn't ever dug into, like, did Paul write Hebrews? Maybe, maybe not. It was good enough for me. Now I needed to know, you know, what do we know? And part of that was the all or nothing aspect of it, right? So I know people were trying to reconcile it, but for me, Jesus said that Noah was a person, and Jesus said that Adam and Eve were person, and Paul said that Adam and Eve were people. And so for me, that was where these reconciling stories just didn't work.
So this was a major worldview change for you. And usually decisions like that are made where you've done basically a cost-benefit analysis. And so what was the cost? What were the benefits for making this change in worldview?
I didn't know what the costs would be, of course. I didn't know that up front. They were significant, and we can talk about that in a bit. But the only benefit to me was intellectual honesty. And I said to this day, like, I'm not recruiting to atheism because, hey, we have better cookies or something. Like, it's not, the reward is intellectual honesty and nothing else. I mean, some of those things eventually come depending on how you interpret it. Like, the Christianity I had was very guilt-based, And so I don't have as much guilt in my life. There's various benefits you can have, but really intellectual honesty was it. It was just like, is this true or not? That was my entire hunger.
So is it fair to say that actually in this way, this kind of investigation, you don't even have to attribute it to anything deeper than stopping the itch?
That's exactly what it was
So what was the cost then?
All of my family, all my business partners, I didn't know someone who wasn't a Christian. Really, there was no one in my life that I spoke to more than once a year that wasn't a Christian. So the idea that I was itching to leave or whatever wasn't there. It was all downside to losing my faith. The cost later became my marriage, relationships with everyone in the church when it kind of became known, and I didn't let everyone know. I was outed against before I was ready. Most of the people in my life quickly cut me off. It's like cut off the sinner, right? You don't reconcile. So I lost most of my friends. I lost my entire social group. I lost, as I mentioned, my marriage fell apart because of it. For a while there, I was touch and go with whether I was going to maintain a relationship with my children, who are all to this day, young Earth Creationist type Christians. So everything. Now, there were a handful of people in my life who continued to be in my life, who continued to love me that whole time and were my friends. But that was, I can count those on one hand versus the hundreds of people I knew around North America who were instantly, I lost that. I had to find new jobs. I had to do everything from scratch. So,
and you could have carried on if you just kept your mouth shut and pretended.
Right. Which that was my plan.
Right.
I couldn't be in the family I was in and not go to church every week. So, I would sit in the pew and try not to yell at the pastor because he was saying things that I knew were wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's an important thing I think the listeners need to hear is that this was a huge cost for very little benefit, except, as you said, integrity. You just wanted to be real with what you say.
That was the only reward I had. And, yeah.
Now, it did change after that. You then became a man with a mission. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that.
Certainly. So one thing that compounded afterwards is I learned that I had quite an aggressive cancer shortly after the rest of this stuff had happened. And after I avoided the parade of, God has given this to you to judge you.
They actually said that?
I was going to ask. I thought it was insensitive, but that's such an obvious play. That's going to happen.
Yeah, but that 1,000%. It was like, and basically it was like, well, when you repent, you'll be healed of this thing. So I definitely got those. People came out of the woodworks to give me that message for sure.
Oh, the vultures. They always come out. Yeah.
Anyway, during that time, so I was having this bit of, at the time, my life was legitimately in jeopardy. And I had all this stuff that I knew. My relationship with my kids hadn't fully recovered from the break yet. And so when you're getting close to not being around, you do think about your legacy, whether you think there's a life after this or not. Mm-hmm. And part of it was I had learned so many things in that short brief period of time. I felt like I wanted to put that out in some way. And so one thing I knew how to do from just my previous life was make video content. And so what I wanted to do was create videos that my kids could potentially watch at some point if I wasn't around anymore to extend this relationship and to let them, so that at least they could understand where I was coming from. And part of the reason why I started my channel with, I wanted to track my voyage, but also it was like breaking from Young Earth Creationism is less controversial than straight up, God's not real and Jesus didn't die, or, he died, I think he died, but Jesus didn't rise, or, whatever. Right. So I started with the Young Earth Creationism, and specifically Ken Ham and Eric Hovind were the two people I kind of really focused on and said, these ministries are lying to the most people. Mm-hmm. And so let me try and address these. And the flavor that I thought I could bring was that most people doing this were speaking to people on the other side of atheism. And I really wanted to, and so fine, swear and make jokes about it and stuff. And that's fine. But if you are the kind of Christian I was, if you hear the F word, nothing that happens after that sinks in, right? Like it's just, that's the stopper. Oh, you said a bad word. Well, now I can dismiss everything. So I was very specifically wanting to make content that a Christian would at least watch, right? Or in my head, what would I have maybe watched? I know it would have seemed blasphemous, but that was the style I was going for. And so I started this YouTube channel, Paulogia, specifically for those missions that I just spoke about.
Right, yeah.
During those moments between the time you leave your faith, you have to deal with the cancer, you have the vultures coming out. Do you ever believe them? Like, do you ever have this part in the back of your head is like, well, maybe,
No, you know what? Not so much that, but it would be verses that would come to me. So like, it's impossible for those who have once been enlightened, who have turned away, for them to be restored. And like, it's verses like that pop in your head. It's like, I turned away. Now it's impossible for me. Like, maybe I just turned away, but according to the Bible, because I did that, I can't be restored. Like, I've tasted the heaven enlightenment, and now I've lost it. So one of the things I get a lot from people who leave their faith is the fear of hell seems to last for months or years for people.
Yep.
And when you believe in that literal hell, that's the thing that kind of wakes you up at night and says, "Are you sure?"
Mm-hmm.
Now, you find that there's still parts of Christianity that you think you can still hang on to, parts of the belief system that you say, well, yeah, I can embrace that. I just can't embrace the whole thing I grew up with.
No, for me, I ended up deciding that none of these books were inspired in any way by a God. And so if there is a God, he was not involved with the 66-book Bible that I was familiar with. And so anything that happened to be wisdom in there was wisdom that I could get anywhere. Like, it's not like love your neighbor as yourself was first practiced, when Jesus was walking around. People had empathy. Oh, I don't want to get hit in the head, so maybe I shouldn't hit other people in the head. I found out that would have been around, for centuries before that. So no, like, this whole soft truth, the lower T truth or whatever. I mean, sure, there's things in the Bible that I would love if people would practice more, but the idea of sin and that there is a God whom I owe a debt to, and therefore somehow someone had to come and pay that debt. Like, as soon as that's gone, holding on to love your neighbor as yourself, okay, but it's not derived from anything that I would have recognized as Christianity.
Are you familiar with the Jefferson Bible?
No.
Thomas Jefferson basically took all the ethical stuff he liked out of the New Testament and literally cut the pages out and then just pasted it into a thing and said, like, this is what I am. Like,
sure. But like, slaves obey your master wouldn't be in there, right? Like, yeah.
So it was, you talked about,
well, for Jefferson it would, but
okay. Right. Yes. He was actually quite big on that. I understand, but that's a different podcast.
Now, you talked about, you lost the trust of authorities. You lost the whole idea that the Bible was 100% true. Now it was 99% true. You talked a bit about that. I know in one of your videos, you talked about divine hiddenness. That was another issue for you. I don't know if that's something we can talk about here or not.
Sure. Yeah. Divine hiddenness for me is, and I don't think it applies to the whole world, but for me, it is actually the one bit of evidence that you can say against God. Like, a lot of people say, oh, I lack a belief in God or whatever. For me, divine hiddenness is the thing that's the proof. And so I'll go over briefly what divine hiddenness in my mind is. And this is modeled after Schellenberg's famous syllogism for it. If there exists an all-loving God, he would want all people to come to a relationship to him. So secondly, if there are people, if anyone is honest in wanting to come to God, God will find them. So the conclusion is, if there are people, and this isn't quite the formal syllogism, but for me, if there exist people who honestly want to know God, but to whom God has not revealed himself, that is evidence that there is not an all-loving God. There might be a creator God, there might be a deist God, whatever, but an all-loving God who deals with heaven and hell just can't be. And I've searched myself. I continue to search myself. If I found the evidence I was looking for, would I become a Christian? And I believe, if I'm honest with myself, yes. Why wouldn't I? Why would I not? If I believed it to be true, I would come back right away. So when it comes to divine hiddenness, for me, I can know my own thoughts. Other people can brush me aside and say, oh, you're suppressing truth and unrighteousness, or you're just, God has a story. Some people in my family believe that this is part of a story that God has for me and that it's going to be part of a testimony later on. It's a matter of timing versus a matter of evidence.
But this is like the Dostoevsky novel. Like, this is like Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan turns for these reasons. And it's like, and maybe that's true. Maybe somewhere at the end, I do come up and say, but right now, my integrity demands that I return my ticket. Like, in good conscience, I cannot pretend that this is okay right now.
Correct. Yeah. So for me, I would prefer, if God existed, I would prefer to have the evidence. I'd prefer to be convinced. But because I don't believe that anyone can choose what they're convinced of. Mm-hmm. God has not provided me with enough to convince me. So that's a big problem.
So because I kind of like, I go down rabbit holes, right? So I hear some of the things that you said, and I was like, oh, interesting. I like the things that I've wanted to ask you about, like, what was behind, like, when your child rejects your beliefs, that video that you made on YouTube. given that the way it's very much counseling to someone who you were, not who you are. Like it seems to be directed towards.
Well, I still, as I mentioned, I don't really care if people who agree with me watch my videos. Like some people, that's fine. But I much prefer, as I mentioned, I made this to talk to who I used to be. It was, unfortunately, that video was surrounding a very bad piece of advice that I felt that was going to cause strife in relationships, where relationships didn't need to have strife. Like, I don't think it's a job of a child to witness. They should witness to their parent, but to evangelize their parent. Like that, there's a power dynamic problem there that isn't going to be compatible with evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, I was honestly giving my best possible advice that how a Christian kid should work in that scenario. Now, I have Christian kids who I feel have adopted a great model, and that's where it came from, is they love me.
Mm-hmm.
They don't agree with me. There are certain topics we've decided we can't talk about. And that's sad. That hurts all of our feelings. But because we value the relationship more than they need to give me a ticket out of hell, or if I'm to get a ticket out of hell, it's going to come through love and the Holy Spirit, not because one more argument was won. And so when I saw the Hovens basically trying to say that the kids should be just schooling themselves so that they can win an argument against their parent, I just don't think that's a good evangelical strategy. Mm-hmm. So that video had nothing to do with whether this stuff's true or not. It was just sharing my life and how these believer, non-believer dynamics should work.
And now that I've kind of come back to this topic, because I went off, did my, graduate work in philosophy and theology and all that, because I am interested in that stuff. And I kind of left this world behind. And now that I've been doing these episodes with Luke, and, I still am in a church, and I still have like in extended family and things like that, people who are fairly strongly in evangelical, but never quite as isolated as what you grew up with. Part of being Southern Ontario, you're not the prairies. It's hard to maintain the walls that well.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to figure out why I object to certain things that they believe, and why other things that I'm going to let go. Like, I don't mind. And then other things I'm like, no, I actually kind of want to fight you on this. I kind of want to push on this, much like you did here. And it strikes me that the one criteria that we discovered in all this is, does you believing this force you to be cruel? And I find that that's what I kind of associate with evangelical theology, is that all those people who rejected you and even did like this sort of, touchdown dance on your illness, like some of these are actually nice people.
I used to think so.
And no, but like maybe they still are in a way. And I'm coming around to this because like for a long time, like you just can't be. It's just that the theological position you're in, this ideological position that you're in, has this in and out group. And every time, like I even think teaching like the kids to like talk about that way, you're bringing an ambiguity and complexity into their thinking. That is the enemy to this, right? And so this makes them be cruel. Like it's a whole thought pattern, because they simply cannot accept the dissonance that comes with believing this and existing with that, which is behind your Genesis people, because they're just about making sure that the walls around the base nice and high. Yeah, they can feel good about being there, right? And they're just trying to keep people from going over the walls. Right. And so I wonder, and I want to push you on something, and this is not some like low key bring Paul back into Christianity kind of thing. I actually find the journey pretty interesting. And once you get away from the hell economy, like all the urgency is gone, right? Like everything is just like, you have an interesting story. I want to know more about it. I'm very fascinated with how people who are really thinking hard about this manage this phase, because you were in evangelicalism way longer than me.
Yeah.
And way harsher. But the spidey sense tingling is, are you still buying into their categories? And which categories of evangelicalism do I hate? And one is the all or nothing. And so when I hear like your theodicy argument, the divine hiddenness argument, that's like sort of, it kind of tweaks me. It's like, are you demanding more of explanations than should be demanded? And like, that's not like a push. It's just sort of, I'm just putting that out there. Luke hates when I do this.
Oh, I've come to the idea, and I've explored this, because I think one of the linchpins for me is I cannot choose what I'm convinced of. Like, I can't convince myself that the room I'm in now is painted pink just by believing it. There's a certain amount of evidence that I will need, and I understand all the, like, I did this video recently on the extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. I believe that's true for everyone, because whatever you don't believe, you consider extraordinary. And everything you is close to what you already believe, that's kind of ordinary. So I don't need that much evidence. So have I weirdly put myself in the situation where maybe I'm going to now need more evidence for Jesus' resurrection than someone who, oh yeah, there's a God in the world and he intervenes. That person, okay, eyewitness testimony, great. I understand I'm coming at this now with some biases that is going to make the evidential burden higher, but I didn't choose that.
Oh, no, it's precisely, like, as I said, why one of the ways in which you're so interesting to me, because, like, you have chosen to be open for whatever motivations, but, like, this documents a kind of journey where you've had to acquire some skills. I watched some of that. That's probably what's bringing it to my head. I didn't realize that actually that William Craig was such a jerk. I didn't know much about him. Like, he's not some world famous philosopher really, but he has a decent pedigree. Like, he did study with Moltmann in Munich, but I had never really come across him in that world, because he's in that little subculture. And so it kind of gets sealed off from other stuff. And I mean, I kind of admire your bravery, because you're just like walking into a world in which you are admittedly an amateur, and you're like, well, all I can do is be as open as I can. I'm going to trace my thinking as, like, this is what I mean by these words. This is what I mean. Why are you in your position making fun of me as a person? What is wrong with you? And that makes me want to ask about one thing we asked about earlier, which is, now that you've had like a week or so or a couple of weeks to absorb it, how does your positive or civil interaction with Hovind, like, how's that playing in your head now? That you actually, so for the listeners, can you explain, like, what happened just like going into his class?
Certainly. So I think I alluded to it earlier that Eric Hovind was kind of the man I built my channel around at the start of things, partially because he also was a layperson, but he got all the experts on. And that was actually kind of model I liked, because he didn't know everything, so he would get the experts on. So I kind of focused on Eric. But because I focused on him so much, we are on the internet enemies. Like, we are polar opposites. So I had a chance, because he teaches a Bible school class, and he opened it up because of the COVID situation to anyone could take the class. You had to pay a little money, but I said, let me take the class. Let me see what Eric is teaching. And on the last day of class, they normally go and speak to atheists as part of their thing. They go literally on a field trip and go find atheists to talk to. The class couldn't do that. I decided, you know what? I've sat here quietly. I'm going to put up my hand. The long story short is, Eric and I got to have an hour-long conversation in front of his class. And there was a me from 3 years ago that would have wanted to own him on scientific bits and pieces. I've dreamt of this for years, to be able to nail him to the wall on specific bits. And yet here I am 3 years later. It's like, you know what is more important to me than that? There's 180 people in this class for whom I would rather demonstrate what a civil conversation should look like between people who don't agree on anything than to nail him and embarrass him in front of his 180 students on whether the moon recedes and whether that is evidence for 6,000 years old. So not only did I have this hour-long conversation with this class in which we were civil to each other, I then reached out to Eric. I'm like, should more people see this? And I actually put that conversation up on my channel. Now, it was a bit of a risk, because I didn't nail him to the wall on things, which is normally what my channel is about, is like finding the facts and presenting it. And so I have had this weird, like, 80% of people love it. 20% of people, both Christians and atheists, think that this should never have happened and are mocking us for not having won the day. And yet, it's my most commented video I've done in a long time. I have to stay out of the comments because some people hate it so much. But yeah, it's this weird evolution of my channel that I would rather have a good conversation with people.
But I think it's interesting, because I debated libertarians when I was in New Orleans. I debated some of, like, the Ron Paul people, and I'm like, do I even dignify their position with, like, a debate, right? Like, that's what the danger is that you're giving them more credibility than they deserve. But in the spirit of what I was talking about earlier, that even these little things that you did with, like, how to talk to your kids, they create ambiguity and complexity. It is really the enemy of that entire way of thinking. And so that Eric may not realize this, but in modeling this kind of civilized discourse where both sides are being listened to and people are seeing each other as reasonable people who can say these things, I mean, I don't think you did it strategically. I think you're a prairie Canadian and you're just nice. And when it comes down to it, it's hard to stick the dagger in.
Right.
But I think that had you been strategic in a cold way, like this is a long-term kind of thing where the rigidness has been undercut, where you have 180 kids in that classroom who saw civilized discourse with an atheist, and suddenly ambiguity and complexity goes in, and that can be like a virus.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's kind of like, sometimes, evangelicals are very hardline on homosexuality until suddenly they know someone.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's like, oh, so I kind of wanted to be that, this is that first atheist I'm meeting who is not terrible in the way that I've been told they are terrible.
Right.
So.
Well, personally, I think you've demonstrated something very important. I think the listeners can learn a lot from you. And I want to thank you for telling us your story and letting us learn from you. Now, some of the listeners may not know where to get your material. Where can they find your YouTube channel?
The most important thing that I do is, my YouTube channel, Paulogia, spelled Paulogia. It's a play on a Greek word from 1 Peter, which is the defense of the faith, apologia. So I took my name, and anyway, it's weird to spell, but Paulogia. And I'm also on Twitter and Facebook if people want to interact with me there.
Okay. And I suspect Boyd and I are going to be contacting you again for some other upcoming episodes.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
No, I had fun. This was great.
Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure, guys.
Wow, that was a really fascinating interview. His story is really quite compelling. One of the things that I want to emphasize is how this decision to give this up wasn't taken lightly. This was something that took a long time. It pulled a lot out of him. It came at great cost. It affected his relationship with everyone in his community. Many of the people he worked with and relied on and valued. It took the better part of a year for him to make the decision. And really, the only thing that compels him is that brain itch he talks about, this integrity, this search for truth. Really nothing more than that.
And I can relate to that completely. I went through very, very similar emotions. We listened a couple months ago to Rhett and Link, and Rhett in particular, talking about the emotions that he went through. It's a huge emotional roller coaster experience. And again, as you just said, the only reason for doing it is not for fame and fortune. It's because you want to be true. You want to be honest to yourself and to people that you care about. Now, related to that, Paul made another comment that I really want to unpack. And I want to go through this because it speaks directly to the people who will now judge Paul and people like him. Paul said, you can't choose what you're convinced of. In his search for truth, he didn't find enough to convince him. He searched with his heart, mind, and soul, and he could not find something to convince him. You can't fault him for that. It's not that he found it and willfully chose to reject it. You can't assume or claim differently just because it helps you with your own worldview. None of us knows Paul's motives or reasons, except for what he's told us, what went through his head. And again, I can resonate completely and directly and personally with that searching in my own head and with the same feeling of just coming up short. If I can self-promote here, in one of my blog posts from a couple of years ago, I went back and checked, August 7th, 2016 to be exact. The title is 3 o'clock in the morning. I related one experience I had searching with all my heart and coming up empty-handed. I really did want to find something, and I just did not. Now, what I wrote about there was more of a search from the heart, and Paul might have been referring more to a search from the head, and I've had those as well, and I still equally come up empty-handed. And here's the thing, you can't blame Paul. You can't blame me for not trying. The only thing that separates Paul and me is how we resolved that cognitive dissonance. Again, I've already talked about that in episode number 3, the reconstruction of my faith, and we'll explore that idea next week with a different guest.
And when you're looking at what separates you and Paul, I think one of the things where we can find that's different is what is the community like when you do it? So Paul was in a community where as soon as he confided in someone that he trusted about his doubts, he was outed. And then the community immediately rejected him.
Right.
And he had no fallback subcommunity to kind of go to. Like there was no place for him to work this out where he was not just like completely attacked from all sides, which is kind of different than your experience.
Yeah, totally. I went through a lot of the exact same kind of doubts. I was asking the same kinds of questions and going through the same thought process. But I had a group around me that would put up with many of the questions that I asked. They let me vocalize these things to process them through. And rather than just telling me to be quiet, they gave me food for thought. I've mentioned one particular group often in my blogs that I wrote in the past few years, my evangelicalism therapy group, I called them. Paul and Ken, Sarah and John, Janet and Keith, and a few others. They really helped me with my toxic religious upbringing. I apologize for referring to it in that way, but for me, it was very toxic. It killed my faith. That upbringing killed my faith. I also had colleagues and fellow students from the Div College that I attended for a few years. They gave me a lot of new ideas, new perspectives that were just not available to me before. And they helped me to find a new kind of Christianity that worked for me.
And that kind of harkens back to something that we talked to Paul about in the interview, where I said that he made this video about how do you deal with your kids when they start to not believe what you believe. And this interesting idea that he was directing the video at like the person he was, thinking about his relationship with his own children, that how do you manage these differences? And so what do you think? Like, what would you say to our own listeners about how to manage this moment for yourself or with people in your life?
For people in your life, I'm suggesting what you need to be is patient and supportive, not judgmental. Don't cut them off. Don't be exclusive, but realize that this is a process and they need to embrace a religion that works for them and not necessarily the faith that they inherited from you. I've heard this phrase, God has no grandchildren.
Well, I do think it's important to note that if you're never going through this dialectic, we call it like this kind of zigzag where you have moments where you're like, wait, what's going on here? Then it never gets deeper. So when it comes to the Bible, if you never have this Marcionite phase, which was this early Christian who just wanted to like toss the Old Testament as like a bad God and Jesus is the good God, if you never have that moment because you're like, wait, that doesn't quite add up with this, then you're just not thinking very deeply.
Right.
If you never at least toy with the atheism idea, then it's like you haven't chosen what you're doing. Like it's not you. Mm-hmm. You are in fact living your parents' faith at that point, because it's kind of the way I kind of resonate with Paul in a way that I don't with a lot of other people who would fundamentally agree with me. It's just their understanding of what they are is so shallow that they haven't asked the questions.
Right.
That maybe I'm not with him on his answers, but the questions are important.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, one of those questions that comes up, and Paul referred to it, and I wanted to unpack that as well, is the motivating influence behind this decision. Paul asked briefly about the fear of hell, how that factors into this journey. And that is something I hear so many people say. I remember Rhett and Link in their discussions, they talked about it too. And I've talked to people who go through this. What if I now die? Am I going to go to hell because I've rejected all of this? I've felt that myself. I think we're going to have to do an episode sometime on hell. We don't have the time to get into it now, but I do want to say that there's something very unchristian, very unloving in claiming that God says anything like, love me or I'll kill you and roast you in hell. That can't be the way that God wants us to make disciples of all nations, scaring them into the kingdom.
Yeah, that would be Tom Wright's God so hated the world, he killed his only son. That's like such a turnaround of what the point is.
Right. Even as I'm saying these words, I'm remembering we, back in my days, I don't know if you did this, Boyd, but we had our Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames show where we put on a stage play, basically brought people in. And the bottom line of this show was people were ushered to the pearly gates, and they either went to heaven or to hell based on their life's decision. And the point behind this whole thing was, unless you change now, turn or burn, you are going to roast in hell. So make a decision for Christ tonight. We used to take glee in being able to say we want to scare the hell out of people because we were.
Yeah, I remember that exact thing being performed at Bethel. This was one of the first times where, like, I think as an adult, I'd gone because I was visiting back from Boston, and my mother was genuinely scandalized at my response. Like,
which was
what?
why
Because I thought it was just not just like laughable, but like kind of offensive.
And how old were you then?
Oh, this is when I'm like in my 20s. So,
okay.
But I remember seeing those things when I was younger, and this sort of dramatization of this moment, and I can't see how that fails to corrupt Christianity.
Right.
Like, it then becomes just such a self-absorbed religion because you're just doing it so that you don't go to hell, and then there's no love in it at all.
Now, you mentioned one church. We did this at my church as well. And also when I worked at a summer camp, and we would do this on a weekly basis. I mean, it wasn't the bona fide Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames show, but it was the same kind of thing. We were trying to bring people to that point where they were scared into the kingdom. And when I look back on it now, I just shake my head, I have to say.
Wow. But I think this kind of comes to this larger point, which I think is a thread for you that you've been doing the work to go through. Paul recounts the work of going through this. And I think you've put a lot more time right now into going through it. And that's where I tried to push him a little, which is whether the problem is that you have a misplaced view of the Bible.
Right. And as you say, I went through that myself. That eventually forced him to give it up. The whole idea that he thought the Bible was not what he'd been led to believe that it was. He was taught only that it's a fully divine document, 100% accurate in everything it said, because it was God's own word. And if it was off by only 1%, then it couldn't be fully true, that whole inerrancy and fallibility thing. And then he wouldn't be able to trust any of it. I want to emphasize this point because I see it so often. So many people I know give up their faith because of problems they had with the Bible. And again, I lived that myself. That's part of what unhinged my own faith. Just a few weeks ago, I was answering comments on our Facebook page, and there was one comment from Nate that said exactly this. His own comment was, and I've written it down here, so what's the point of Christianity? If the Bible isn't true some of the time, then it isn't true at all. And there was more to his comment than that, and several other people then responded to it, including myself. But the point I want to make here is that people equate Christianity with this collection of documents written by humans. And even though I went through the same kind of deconstruction as Paul and Nate and so many others, the way I came up on the other side was to realize that the Bible is very much a human document as well. It's written and colored and biased by Bronze Age, pre-scientific Middle Eastern males. Even the Bible itself doesn't say anything differently. The Bible doesn't make the kind of claims about itself that are frequently made by fundamentalist biblicists. I know the first thing the Bible defenders will jump to is a passage that begins with, all scripture is inspired. It's from 1 Timothy. And Boyd and I have already talked about that in detail in a third of our three-part series on evangelicalism, and we're not going to repeat that here, except I want to say that inspired does not mean dictated. It does not mean divinely written or divinely composed. And you can go back to that previous episode to see what we say about what divine inspiration can also mean. So a lot of people, both believers and non-believers, really have a misplaced idea when they talk about the Bible as divinely inspired, especially when what they really mean inside their heads is divinely dictated. It might shock them to hear me say that, in my opinion, those people who give up their faith because their view of the Bible has been shattered by science, that they're no less fundamentalist or literal biblicist than the believers that they separate themselves from. They haven't yet let go of a very fundamentalist understanding of biblical inerrancy and biblical literalism.
And the important part for me, at least the part that just keeps jumping to my head and what I push Paul on, is that sometimes what you're talking about, like the Bible itself, is not where the conflict is taking place. It's about the lens you're looking at the Bible with.
Right.
And so people often accuse fundamentalists of what we call bibliolatry. It's like you worship the book, not the God.
Right.
And you'll do more to defend the book than you will to defend the God. And the idea that the word of God is in fact Christ himself, not the words. But when you buy into this philosophy that has this very specific structure, when you use that lens and only talk about that, that's where the fundamentalism comes from. The fundamentalism is the hard right angles on the lens through which you're reading the Bible.
Right, yeah.
And what I wanted to push Paul on, and what I think you're working very hard to overcome, is that like those hard lines that are in like this glass panel that you're looking at the Bible through, this lens, that if you look away from the Bible and become an atheist and you're like, I reject it all, you still have all these hard-edged right angles in your thinking patterns.
Yep.
And I think part of the admirable work that you're doing is like making this effort to try to like kind of work on those edges and figure out whether or not the lens can be shaped differently. And I find a lot of atheists, like the evangelical atheists, the Dawkins, Bennett Harris types, have all the hallmarks of the evangelicalism hard lines. And they have the same sort of patterns. And that's why it becomes an all or nothing decision, because of their all or nothing thinking.
Right.
Although I want to be sensitive, because these dialectical shifts, these move from zigzags, I think if you come out of this really hardcore Christianity, and wow, his was hardcore, sometimes the only way mentally you can even make any break at all is to make the complete break.
Right.
And then it takes a long time to figure out what you can keep. And I really admire what he's doing, because he's being authentic about it. Like he's really trying, he's really sensitive to the people in his life that he came from. He's honoring his own tradition by addressing them in language that they can understand. So I'm really happy we talked to him about this.
Yeah, I am too. And just to get back to something you said a minute ago, some people would say it's an overly used term, deconstruction and reconstruction, but I find that to be so important to think of it that way. You have to completely deconstruct a lot of your previous ways of thinking and then start to reconstruct a whole new Christianity, because I found it does not work just putting on patches and braces and nailing things onto a poor foundation. You need to start all over again. But I do also want to echo what you said, Boyd. I think it was great to have Paul on. I hope we hear some of his comments and reply to some of our unpacking of what he had to say. And I think we are definitely going to be bringing him on in the future episodes because he's got a great perspective that we can learn from. So we invite the listeners to also send in comments to us, and we will talk to you next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with Luke Janssen and Boyd Blundell.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found that somewhat useful or enlightening. Are you facing now, or perhaps faced in the past, some of those same challenges to your faith? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. If you're itching for my news, theology, or science content, you're in luck. You can just tap on the thumbnail on your screen now. I'll see you there. Until next time, later.